A lab assistant becomes the hero we both need and deserve. Hi, I'm Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and welcome to the final installment of the Mega Manniversary. It was on this day, December 17th, in 1987, that the original Mega Man, known in Japan as Rockman, was released for the Nintendo Famicom. And that's how we end this thing, with some games simply titled Mega Man. So let's get started with a little history. I went over the plot of the first game and series legacy in the Mega Man 5 episode, so this time I want to talk about the company that made the game, Capcom. Capcom was founded in 1979 in Osaka, Japan as IRM Corporation, a company opened to distribute electromechanical games like pinball. In 1981, they established a subsidiary called Japan Capsule Computer and changed the parent company name to Sanbi. The first major milestones for the company happened in 1983, when they changed the name to Capcom, a shortening of Capsule Computer, and opened an office in Tokyo, still operating under the umbrella of Sanbi. That July, they also released their first game, an electromechanical baseball game called Little League. A year later, they released their first video game, Vulgus. In 1985, the company opened Capcom USA and began releasing ports of their arcade hits on the Famicom and later NES. But Capcom was still an arcade developer, so they farmed out their first few NES ports to a company called Micronix, who had mixed results. Capcom did not have an internal team of developers for home systems until 1986. And even then, the home group was still just porting arcade games, with the first two NES games developed internally at Capcom being Trojan and Section Z. But in 1987, it was decided that they needed to make games directly for the booming home market. Takuro Fujiwara and Akira Kitamura were tapped to create Capcom's first game made specifically for consoles. And that brings us to our first game of this episode, the original Mega Man for the NES, which I am playing once again on the Mega Man Legacy Collection for PlayStation 4. This is mostly because carts of that original title have gotten pretty pricey, and also because this version allows you to save. Unlike later installments, the original Mega Man has no password feature or battery backup, so you have to play the entire game in one sitting. Capcom evidently tapped the right folks to make this game, because they really hit it out of the park on their first try, and that is not something most devs of this era pulled off. The game puts you in the shoes of Rock, a boy robot who begins life as a lab assistant to his creator, Dr. Thomas Light. When 6 of his industrial robots are stolen by rival Albert Wily and reprogrammed to be destructive, Light turns Rock into Mega Man, a combat robot who can take the abilities of other robots. All of this isn't actually in the game, but that doesn't matter. When you press start, you're greeted with something that was very much a rarity at the time: the ability to choose which of the first 6 stages you wanted to take on. And now you can just Google the best order, but in the day, this was very much a trial and error process in which you would find yourself solving the puzzle of which stage would be easiest to start with. and once Mega Man starts taking robot abilities, figuring out where to go next to best use your new weapon. And while the game clearly uses a rock, paper, scissors approach, that doesn't completely hold, making it a little more challenging. Yes, Gutsman can throw rocks, which in turn crush Cutman's scissors, but Fireman is actually weak to Iceman's weapon, not the other way around, as logic might dictate. Another thing you would note playing this game for the first time is the great tunes. This game has an absolutely fantastic soundtrack, though not as good as some of the later entries in the series. The same goes for the graphics. The color palette here is a bit muted compared to what would come in later installments, but for the time it looked awesome. And one thing that hasn't aged are the stage designs. The biggest strength this game continues to show in the modern world are these stages. The team created a flexible difficulty curve that sees each individual stage present various hazards and enemies in a way that ramps up over the course of that stage, since they can be played in any order. So you don't have to have played Elecman's largely vertically oriented stage in order to be able to beat Iceman's disappearing block challenges. Each level is a self-contained difficulty curve.
Sadly, the same cannot be said for the bosses.
The original Mega Man didn't quite hit the balance when it came to bosses. If you have the weapon they're weak to, they're pushovers. And if you don't, some of them, like Elecman, are extremely tough with your default shot. The only one who remains even a bit tough with the right weapon is Fireman, because he shoots so fast and leaves hazards on the ground. But even then, this is only really a problem in Wily's castle when you have to face several of the bosses again in a row. And speaking of Wily, even he is incredibly easy. Later games, especially the direct sequel, Mega Man 2, made Wily pretty tough, requiring very specific tactics and less than stellar weapon choices. But here, his attacks are slow and predictable, and once you do even cursory experimentation with the weapons to find out which works best, he's a chump.
Ultimately, Mega Man is overshadowed by its sequels, particularly parts 2 and 3, and not unreasonably so. In fact, this is pretty common on the NES when you think about it. Super Mario Bros. 3 is considered by almost everybody to be much better than Super Mario Bros. Castlevania 3 is considered by most people to be better than Castlevania, and so on. But what about other versions of Mega Man? Well, let's take a look at the Genesis version.
The what, you say? Genesis version? Yes, there is an official Sega Genesis version of Mega Man, released as part of Mega Man Wily Wars, known in Japan as Rockman Mega World, and developed by our old friends at Minakuchi Engineering, who did most of the Game Boy Mega Man titles. This Mario All-Stars style compilation of the first 3 NES Mega Man games was actually released in the US during the lifespan of the Genesis, but like Game Freak's pre-Pokemon platformer Pulseman and Treasure's Boss Fight Fest Alien Soldier, only on the Sega Channel. Though it did finally get a later release in one of AtGame's officially licensed handheld Genesis clones, which I cannot really recommend. So how is it? Well, it's not bad. At the time, I can certainly see the value proposition of 3 classic Mega Man games being a lure. Still, things just feel a bit off. The jump physics don't feel exactly right in some spots. Some of the redone FM synth music is pretty good, but some is, less so. Oh, and you can't cheese the Yellow Devil in Wily's castle with the pause trick. Though his bricks move way, way slower in this version for some reason, so you probably don't need to. Also, the magnet beam doesn't work in quite the same way, which I found a bit frustrating in some parts. As for level layouts and bosses, it's pretty faithful. I didn't notice any blocks or ladders or enemies that were in different places than the NES, though some of the aesthetic decisions are weird. For example, Cutman stage is now indoors for some reason, and it just looks odd. The bosses themselves have the same weaknesses and still go down very easily to the right weapon, though Fireman is now even easier due to him not firing shots off as quickly as in the NES game. Overall, it's really not bad, but it's worse than the NES version in almost every way, even if subtly so. So it's only worth revisiting for big fans, especially if you're going to play through all 3 games to unlock the Wily Tower mode found in the game, which adds some new robot masters. And finally, if you're playing on an NTSC system, go with the Japanese version. The English ROM found in most places is the PAL version, and it introduces some weird quirks into the gameplay due to the difference in refresh rate.
But before we move on, I do want to briefly touch on 2 versions I will not be going into in depth. The first is the Anniversary Collection version. This is based on the PS1 port that was released in Japan only. It adds an easy mode and some remixed music, but other than that, there's not much going on here. It also fixes a couple of things, including removing the pause trick glitch for the Yellow Devil. Ultimately, the Legacy Collection version is a lot more accurate, so I would seek that version out over this version. The other one I want to talk about very briefly is Megaman Powered Up for the PSP. Now, normally I wouldn't even mention this, but people got pretty upset at me that I didn't even mention Twin Snakes in the Metal Gear Solid episode.
Megaman Powered Up is a remake of Mega Man for the PSP released in 2006. It adds 2 new Robot Masters to bring the total up to the series' standard 8, features new graphics and music, fully voiced cutscenes and story, and allows you to unlock all the Robot Masters, plus Roll and Proto Man as playable characters. Kinda reminds me of a dream I had. Dreamed I was a fireman. I just smoked and watched you burn.
Now, I'm not going to give Mega Man Powered Up a full rundown because it doesn't have the same name, but interestingly, there are 2 games that do. North American exclusives not developed by Capcom. Let's start with Mega Man on DOS.
If you've been on the internet long enough, you've no doubt at least heard of this game. Capcom licensed out a few of their titles to High Tech Expressions, the real worst publisher in video game history, to make PC ports in the early 90s. One of the victims was the Blue Bomber himself in this... whatever this is. It's ugly, it's slow, it doesn't have any music, it's not even funny, it's just bad. And who are these 3 jamokes? No one I recognize. I mean, these 3 guys, they make Dustman look awesome. I really cannot recommend enough that you do not play this game. It's excruciating. But if you really feel the need, it's freely available on the Internet Archive as part of their massive storehouse of old PC games. You can play it right in your browser, but I really, truly do not recommend it. This game makes WWF Raw for the Game Gear look like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
There really is not a lot to say about DOS Mega Man other than it's bad. But that brings us to our last game for this episode, which I happen to have on a pirate multi-cart because it's another one of those cartridges that has gotten ridiculously expensive. We're talking about Mega Man on the Sega Game Gear.
This is another one whose reputation precedes it. In fact, one of my favorite game writers, Nadia Oxford, is quoted extensively in the Wikipedia article for this game, saying,
Mega Man often has to fight with his enemies in such close quarters, he may as well hold their hands and try his luck at his friendship instead. The constant screen scrolling and sticky controls makes for a very frustrating game, although the Game Gear's low battery life ends the torment in a couple of hours anyway.
Ouch, Nadia. But you're not wrong. Still, let's take a closer look. This game was developed by Freestyle, perhaps best known for the Amiga port of Super Street Fighter 2, and published not by Capcom, but by US Gold, who also ruined Strider. None of this is a good sign. And weirdly, this game is honestly more akin to a Game Boy version of Mega Man 5 than the actual Game Boy Mega Man 5. This game does what most of the Game Boy games do and takes some bosses from one game and some from another. Here we have Brightman and Toadman from Mega Man 4 on the NES, and Wave Man, Starman, Napalm Man, and Stone Man from Mega Man 5 on the NES. Oh, yeah, and only 6 Robot Masters. 2 of whom are actually Wily Castle stages, so you can't even choose the order. Look, 6 is an understandable number on an NES game from 1987 and the first of the series. But by 1995? 1995! And on a platform more powerful than the NES, when the series has well established 8 as the number, even on the less powerful Game Boy. No excuse. So yeah, Nadia's comment about close quarters is completely on point, and it all stems from the absolute laziness of not redrawing things. Freestyle pretty clearly just lifted the sprites from the NES Mega Man games and plunked them down in this game. And that kind of thing is kind of understandable with the Master System, as happened with Sonic 2, since the hardware is almost identical. But when creating a newish game from mostly scratch, maybe don't use sprites meant for 256 by 240 on a screen that's 160 by 144. I feel like by the year the PS1 and Saturn launched in North America, we probably should have had this figured out. And it's clear the notion that this was a problem at least crossed someone's mind, because you can hold the jump button down and look around with the D-pad. But there are spots where pressing jump is not possible without killing yourself on ceiling spikes. And even when it is possible, it's cumbersome, because you have to hold down the button for a few seconds. And speaking of holding the button down, if you take a hit in this game while charging your Mega Buster, you lose the charge completely and have to start holding it again. Look, this game is not unplayable, but it is deeply flawed. The controls aren't bad per se, but if you're a Mega Man veteran, like the Genesis version, they feel a little off. The screen is cramped, there aren't many stages, the music barely survived the move to the Game Gear's SID chip, you can't continue, although you do get passwords, but the last password you get starts you 3 stages from the end, which to me is a big no-no for a portable game. Another thing that should have been sorted out by 1995. And the final stage? It's literally just Quick Man stage from Mega Man 2, which, sure, that's a great stage in a great game, but you want to try dodging all these lasers all zoomed in like this?
In summation, this game probably has a worse reputation than it strictly deserves, but I still wouldn't recommend it to anyone but die-hard Mega Man fanatics. Especially given the hefty price tag that comes with it these days. All that said, let's do like we always do, and take a look and a listen side by side.
There's an argument to be made that the Genesis version looks the best, simply because the NES original lacks the visual flair of later games in the series, but I still find Capcom's original best in both looks and sound. The DOS version unquestionably looks and sounds the worst, but the Game Gear version also sounds not great.
And that makes it time to give the edge. And surprising, I think, nobody, they got it right the first time. It is absolutely the NES version, however you choose to play it, whether it's on the Legacy Collection, an original cart, the PlayStation version, the Anniversary Collection, Virtual Console, however you do it, Mega Man for the NES is the ultimate version of Mega Man. Now, I will say, if we were talking about the PSP version, I would definitely put it high up on my list. If you own a PSP, this is absolutely a must-buy title for that platform. Then going down the line, I would say the Genesis version, represented here by my EverDrive. If you're a Mega Man fan or a big Genesis fan, it's definitely worth checking out, even if it's not quite as good as the original NES version. And hey, if you're a Mega Man devotee, I would absolutely recommend at least spending some time with the Game Gear version. And if you hate yourself, the DOS version. And that does it. Thank you so much for joining me, not just on this episode here today, but all the episodes leading up to this as part of the Mega Manniversary. And let us all rejoice in the coming of Mega Man 11 next year. I'm excited. I hope you're excited too, because, you know, even if it doesn't look like the old Mega Man games like 9 and 10 did, it's a brand new 2D style Mega Man adventure, and I need that in my life right now. I'm Joe, and I will see you in 2018 right here on Same Name, Different Game.
Super Robot Rockman! 世界の平和のため7つの武器を駆使して悪のロボット軍団を倒せ。アイテムいっぱい、楽しさ抜群。スーパーアドベンチャーゲームファミコンソフトロックマン好評発売中。カプコン